I work for a small nonprofit that collects donated goods, clothes, furniture, anything really, and redistributes it to families in need. We cover a wide area, driving large trucks across the province. Most days are routine: pick up donations, sort them at the warehouse, repeat. But every once in a while, I get a stop that feels off. I had one of those days yesterday. I was given a list of addresses to visit with the usual names and instructions, but one of the addresses stood out, not because it was particularly remote or sketchy, but because the note next to it simply read, "Abandoned house, come inside." I've been doing this job for years, and never before had I gotten such a note. Usually it's a name and number to contact, or instructions on how to reach the house if it's hard to find. But this time, there was nothing. Just an address and that strange instruction. Of course, my gut told me it wasn't a good idea, but I've learned to ignore that voice sometimes. I had a job to do. The house was on the edge of a rundown neighborhood, right next to some vacant lots and a set of old train tracks. The area, like many parts of the city, had a reputation. It was known for high crime rates and little police presence. I'd been there before, but usually I only stayed in the truck. It wasn't a good idea to linger in certain parts of town. As I approached the address, I felt a chill. The house was exactly as you'd imagine, a forgotten, abandoned building. The front door was missing, leaving only a broken frame. The windows were cracked, some even missing entirely. The yard was overgrown with wild grass, weeds, and vines that seemed to have taken over the place. The entire structure sagged, giving it an eerie, neglected look. Something about it just felt wrong. I took a deep breath, reminded myself this was part of the job, and pulled the truck to the curb. I checked the address again. Yep, this was it. I called my office just to confirm, and they assured me that I had the right place. They didn't seem concerned. Maybe they hadn't been here themselves. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel, and walked toward the front. There was no door, just an open black space where it used to be. I hesitated, then knocked on the door frame, even though I knew no one could hear it. No answer. I stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like the air hadn't been disturbed in years. The floor creaked under my weight, the sound amplifying in the emptiness. I took in the scene. Broken light fixtures, cracked walls covered with faded graffiti, puddles of water on the floor from the storm the night before. Everything was abandoned, not a trace of life. I called out into the darkness. "Hello, anyone here?" No answer. I slowly walked further into the house. The floor was littered with garbage, old newspapers, and pieces of broken furniture. The air was thick with dust. But then, as I stepped into the next room, something caught my eye. A piece of paper lying on the floor. It looked out of place, almost too new for a house like this. I bent down to pick it up. It was just regular printing paper, the kind you'd find in any office, but what was written on it made my stomach twist. In messy, blocky print, it read, "I'm in the basement." My heart started to race. There was no way I was going into that basement. Not without a good reason. But curiosity got the better of me, and I felt a strange pull toward the stairs leading down. I walked toward the basement door. The room grew colder as I neared it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The door creaked open, and I saw only darkness below. The stairs were broken, some missing entirely. A deep pit of blackness waited for me down there. I called out again. "Hello? It's just me. I'm from the donation service." There was silence. Then a voice, barely a whisper, drifted up from the basement.
"I'm down here."
I froze. The voice was low, croaky. It sounded like an older man. But there was something about it that sent a chill down my spine. I could barely make out the words. I stood there for a few moments, my mind racing. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my job had always come first. I shouted into the dark. "It's too dark down there and the stairs are broken. I can't come down. If you want to, you can call our office and reschedule for another day." Silence. Then the voice spoke again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. "Don't worry about the steps, just come down here." I felt my blood run cold. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn and run. I'd heard enough horror stories in my life to know this wasn't a good situation. It could be a trap. It could be something much worse. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. Without even thinking, I turned and began walking briskly toward the front door. As I reached the threshold, I heard the voice again. "Where are you going? Come back." I snapped into a full sprint. I didn't stop to think, didn't hesitate. My heart hammered in my chest as I flew out of the door and toward the truck. The whole time, I half expected to hear footsteps behind me or see someone standing at the window. But there was nothing, just the wind blowing through the broken house. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. My hands were shaking, but I sped off anyway, making sure to keep my eyes on the rearview mirror. But the house was gone. Not like it vanished. No, the house was still there, the same dilapidated, broken structure. But when I looked in the mirror, I could have sworn I saw movement in the window. A figure, just for a split second, standing still. A shape in the darkness. I didn't wait around to figure out who or what it was. I called my boss as soon as I could. Told him what happened, and he listened, silent for a moment before speaking. "You should have never gone inside," he said. "A few years ago, we had 2 drivers go to abandoned houses like that. They didn't come back. They said something similar happened to them. Some guy in the basement, making odd requests. They were lucky they got out. You're lucky too." The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much I had narrowly escaped. I wasn't sure what I had walked into, but I had no intention of finding out. I called in and added the address to our do not pick up list. It's been a day since that happened. I still feel on edge. I still wonder what I could have encountered in that basement. I tell myself it's just some lonely man, or maybe a trap set by criminals. But no matter what, I know one thing for sure. I won't be going back to that house. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to remote areas in Australia. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid well, and the work itself was a good mix of tough but satisfying. The way out was simple enough. You'd tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a farm or property, usually a few weeks at a time, where you'd do whatever manual labor was required. You'd meet new people, learn new skills, and sometimes, if you were lucky, you'd even make some friends. Most of the time it was decent, hard work, but on this one job, things went horribly wrong. It happened on a large property, a place I was told was roughly the size of the state of Maryland, USA. It was located about 9 hours from Sydney, and the closest town was 40 minutes away. In other words, it was in the middle of nowhere, and everything about it screamed isolation. I was working there that summer with 3 other guys who were also from the city. The boss, Jeremy, was a good guy, a bit laid back for my liking sometimes, but decent. The heat that summer was unbearable, and we had just finished a brutal few days of clearing bushland. One day, when the temperature hit a scorching 38 degrees Celsius, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided we needed a break. He told us he knew of a waterhole about a 25-minute drive to the north, perfect for cooling off. I was all for it, but the others were less enthusiastic. They preferred to relax and hang around the house, so it ended up being just me and Jeremy. He wasn't much of a talker, so the drive was quiet, just the engine humming over the endless stretches of barren land. But after about 20 minutes, Jeremy suddenly broke the silence and nudged me in the ribs. "Do you see that over there? Beneath the 2 dead trees?" I looked in the direction he pointed, squinting against the harsh sun. And there it was, a huge, bright blue structure in the middle of all that dry brown land. A shipping container. It wasn't like anything you'd expect to see in such an isolated area. We had been driving for miles through flat, lifeless land, and then suddenly, this strange object appeared out of nowhere. Jeremy seemed confused too. He said he'd driven through this area about 5 weeks before and hadn't seen anything like it. Naturally, he was curious, so we decided to investigate. As we approached, things started to get even stranger. The closer we got, the more bizarre it seemed. There was a large diesel generator running behind it, the sound of it echoing across the flat expanse. Around the container, there were several CCTV cameras, all motion-activated, swiveling back and forth as they tracked our movement. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This was starting to feel wrong, but Jeremy insisted that we had to go inside. After all, it was his property, and someone was clearly trespassing. I argued with him a little, suggesting that maybe we should just leave it alone, but he brushed me off. He found a set of bolt cutters in the truck and got to work on the small padlock that held the door shut. After a couple of minutes of struggling, we got it open. Inside was an unexpected shock. The temperature inside was noticeably cooler, the air-conditioned space a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside. I felt a moment of relief as we walked in, but that relief didn't last long. The place was a makeshift office, cluttered with rows of hard drives the size of bar fridges, all humming with activity. Computer monitors sat on desks, flickering with strange data. The whole thing was odd, to say the least. There was a constant low hum from the electronics, almost like the place was alive with energy. Jeremy was fascinated. I wasn't. Something felt deeply unsettling about the place. We started poking around, trying to make sense of it all. Jeremy was more focused on the computer systems, while I just wandered, increasingly uneasy. I remember walking over to a corner of the container where piles of storage boxes sat. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open one. That's when I saw it. At first, it didn't fully register. It was just a collection of posters, DVDs, and photos, stacked neatly in folders and boxes. But as I sifted through them, the weight of what I was seeing hit me like a punch to the stomach. The images were horrific, graphic and vile, depicting child exploitation. It was organized, it was methodical, it was real. I don't know how I managed to stay composed long enough to pull myself away. I ran over to Jeremy, practically dragging him to the boxes, but I could barely speak. My mind was racing, my thoughts scrambled. I stammered something about what I had found, but I didn't need to say much more. We both knew we had to leave, now. We bolted out of the container and back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to vomit. We sped back to the main house, but the farm had no mobile reception, and we hadn't brought the satellite phone. We had to wait until we reached the landline to call the police. The wait felt like hours. Our nerves were frayed. We didn't know who had set up that operation or if they were still watching us. Eventually, the police arrived, about an hour after we'd made the call. They came with 2 four-wheel drives, and we led them back to the container. What we found when we got there, I'll never forget. The shipping container was open, and there was fire inside. Thick black smoke billowed from the door, and the whole structure seemed to be burning. The fire was intense, and we only had 2 small extinguishers with us. They did little to help. It took another hour for the fire department to get there, but by then, most of the damage was already done. The federal police conducted an arson investigation, but it quickly became clear that most of the evidence had been removed. The computer equipment we'd seen was gone, replaced by only a few traces of paper and cardboard. Whoever had been operating that container knew we were there. They had enough time to clear out before we even arrived. We tried to follow up with the authorities, but without concrete evidence, the investigation went cold. They couldn't pinpoint who was responsible. There were too many ways to access the property and too much land to search. No one took us seriously at first, likely due to the poor explanation we gave over the phone, and by the time they'd gotten to the container, it was too late. I've kept in touch with Jeremy since then. The shipping container is still there, abandoned but undisturbed, sitting on his property as if it had never been touched. It costs too much to have it removed. I'll never forget what I saw in those boxes. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the images flashing through my mind. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it still haunts me. I don't know who was behind it, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to find out. In the early 2000s, my mum worked as a cleaner in the coastal region of New Zealand. She had a steady clientele, mostly wealthy families, who lived in sprawling estates. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and Mum was known for her attention to detail and punctuality. Most of her clients were referred by word of mouth, and her business was doing well. She enjoyed the work, but there was always something unsettling about cleaning large, empty homes. One autumn morning, my mum received a phone call from a woman who sounded to be in her early 60s. The lady's voice was polite but distant, and she requested that my mum clean her home. a large old manor located in the hills near the outskirts of the town. The woman explained that the manor had been in her family for generations, but she was now living in another part of the country. She offered an unusually high rate for the cleaning job, and though it sounded too good to be true, my mom was intrigued. The woman didn't want to meet my mom before the cleaning, though. She insisted that she would leave the keys in a small, hidden compartment near the back door and asked my mom to simply let herself in. This struck my mom as strange, but she had dealt with unusual requests before and figured it was just another eccentric client. She agreed to the arrangement. The manor was located about an hour from our home, nestled on a hill surrounded by dense forests. When my mom arrived that morning, the weather was gloomy, with thick clouds covering the sky and a faint drizzle making the long, winding driveway slick with wet leaves. The place was completely isolated, far from the nearest town, and the air felt heavy with quiet. The trees surrounding the manor loomed like silent sentinels, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Mum found the hidden key exactly where the woman had said, under a small stone near the back door. She entered the manor, the old wooden floors creaking underfoot as she stepped inside. The smell of mildew and aged wood hit her immediately. The manor was a labyrinth of grand hallways, dusty furniture, and empty rooms. It looked as if no one had lived there in years, which made her feel uneasy. Still, she set to work, starting in the kitchen and making her way through the house. It was about an hour into the cleaning when she heard it, a door slamming shut somewhere in the house. Mum froze. She was certain no one else was supposed to be there, but the sound was unmistakable. She stood still for a long moment, listening intently. Nothing. No footsteps, no car approaching. The house felt oddly quiet, and yet the sound of that door slamming was vivid in her mind. Her instincts told her to leave, but she still had a few rooms left to clean, and the money was good. Trying to shake off the feeling of dread, Mum walked down a long corridor and entered the first of the 2 bedrooms. The door creaked loudly as she opened it. The room was dark, the only light coming from a cloudy, overcast sky outside. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and the room was cold, despite the heating being on. As Mum began to clean the room, her eyes caught something strange. Spread out across the bed were dozens of photographs, old, black and white images. As she stepped closer, her stomach turned. The photos were of her. Some had been taken in our family home, others at different houses she had cleaned. But what made her blood run cold were the photos that had been taken through windows or over fences. Mum took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She knew immediately that someone had been watching her, following her without her knowing. The photos were so personal, so invasive. There were pictures of her cleaning houses, images of her in her own home, some taken from behind trees or from far-off hills. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been tracking her movements for a long time. Panicked, Mum ran to the nearest phone and called the police, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. She wasn't sure what to do. The house was isolated, and the thought of being alone in that place with whoever had taken the photos was terrifying. Once the call was made, Mum left the manor and drove down the winding driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. The police arrived after what felt like an eternity. They were skeptical at first, as they were often called to isolated properties with strange reports. The lady who owned the manor was distant when questioned, claiming that it was all just a misunderstanding, perhaps a break-in by some prankster. She seemed almost nonchalant, as if this was just another regular day. But as the police searched the house, things got even stranger. The photos were gone. The bedroom, once filled with the disturbing images, was now empty. The woman insisted that nothing was amiss and that the house had been locked when she had left. No one could figure out where the photos had gone or who had been responsible for them. The police could only conclude that it had been a random break-in. But Mum couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The woman had acted too calm, too unaffected by the invasion of her privacy. And what about the photos? Where had they gone? Mum was determined to get to the bottom of it, but the investigation quickly stalled. The woman was never fully investigated, and no evidence of the photos was ever found. After the incident, Mom tried to put it out of her mind, but the haunting memory of the manor, the photos, and the strange woman stayed with her. She could never explain what had really happened that day. She moved on, taking fewer jobs in isolated areas, but every time she looked back on that place, it felt like something was hidden in the shadows, something dark and sinister that no one would ever uncover. Years later, she told me that she couldn't help but think the woman in the manor had known more than she let on. Perhaps she wasn't just a wealthy lady with an eccentric taste for privacy. Maybe she was hiding something far darker. And maybe the photos were just a small part of something much bigger, something no one could ever truly understand. To this day, Mom won't talk about it for long. But I can tell that every time she tells the story, it still sends a chill down her spine. As if something about that place and that woman is still watching, just beyond the edge of her memory.